Hello and welcome to the GPP Chin Music Podcast. I'm Big Italy 42. He is Scott Mail. We got Sports 25 to life. Talking about tonight's huge slate, of course. We've got a ton of good pitchers on the mound tonight, so it's going to be a tough decision. But the good thing about nights like tonight, there's not a whole lot of chalk plays, not a lot of plays that everybody's going to be on. So you can get creative. You can play the guys that you play. You know, not a whole lot of guys you feel like you need to guys that you need to have in your lineups. So starting off at the top here, Clayton Kershaw, $14,400 versus Max Scherzer at $12,500. Both guys more than a minus 200 favorite, both in small totals. Scherzer a 7-run total, Kershaw 6.5. So give me your take here. Between these two guys, is it you want to try to find a way to get Kershaw in, or you're fine with Scherzer, or what's your thought here?
I prefer Scherzer for the price discount for sure. I mean, I'm not even really debating it that hard. I mean, there's a lot of bats in the Cubs lineup. I know they struggle a bit versus lefties. They strike out a lot. There's definitely a ton of upside with Kershaw. I think he's a great GPP play. But, I mean, I think Scherzer's going to be under-owned for how good of a matchup this is. I mean, there's like no one in this Miami lineup that scares me. Scherzer's been, I mean, on the season probably just as good as Kershaw, and you're getting a massive discount there. Obviously, Scherzer's cooled off a little bit lately. I don't think he's gone more than 6 innings in like 4 starts. But I still think he has almost as much upside as Kershaw. I think he's a little bit safer. And, I mean, the price discount, especially in DraftKings, is a huge factor for me.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And, I mean, didn't give up any earned runs, just 3 hits last time he faced this team at Miami with 6 Ks. But like you said, I mean, this could be one of those times where Scherzer has struggled a little bit recently. He turns it back around, goes to one of those 50-point DK outings, complete game shutout, because, like you said, there's not a single bat in this lineup that you're worried about. Obviously, the Kershaw side, we did see these guys strike out 27 times in 13 innings against Bumgarner and Sale, so certainly has that upside. But there's also more risk because there are some good bats in that lineup that could punish him. So, excuse me. So, as we look at other guys near the top, I'm not a huge fan of Matt Harvey just because he's been good but not great recently, facing off against a tough Boston team. I think he's a good GPP play but not a cash game guy for me. A guy that I like quite a bit as I'm looking down here a little bit further, I like Ian Kennedy has been pitching very well recently. He gets a $9,000 price tag against Philly. Philly has been hitting better, but Kennedy in some very tough matchups has looked great over his last few starts. Versus St. Louis, no earned runs, 7 hits in 6 innings. At Colorado, just 1 earned in 6 2/3, 18 Ks in those games. So for me, I love him. And then Raisel Iglesias, it's kind of hard to ignore. I'm sure he's going to be a popular play tonight, coming off that 13K game. And he's only allowed 12 hits total in his last 26 innings. So I think he's going to be a great play as well.
Yeah, I like both sides of that game, actually. Jungmann's been pretty good lately. Not quite as good over the last 2 starts, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
But I think both of these guys have some nice upside in this one. I don't love the price on Jungmann as much as I do on Iglesias on either site, really. But I think in GPPs you can go either way. Another guy I like at the top, Tanaka for the Yankees against Atlanta. That should be a pretty solid outing, I would guess. Not quite as much upside as the top guys we talked about. Maybe not even as much upside as Harvey, although he's got a much, much softer lineup that he's facing in Atlanta. So, I mean, we're 1 game removed from Tanaka going a complete game with 8 strikeouts against Toronto. So, I mean, there's some decent upside there. He's a decent amount cheaper than Harvey, Scherzer, Kershaw. He's right in that like Liriano and Hamels area. Speaking of Liriano, I like him a decent amount against Colorado. They've struggled a bit against lefties. Arenado is really the only righty in that lineup that like I'd really be worried about. Obviously, Liriano's an up and down kind of guy, but when he's good, he's really good. He's a big minus 270 favorite in a 7 over/under game. That's one of my favorite GPP plays tonight. I think he's definitely going to be under-owned. I think there'll be more people on Harvey and the top guys. Tanaka also probably under-owned in GPPs. I think people are going to consider him more of a cash game play, and I think with how deep he can pitch into the game, he has some really nice upside.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think that's a solid point with Liriano. One of those guys I do not trust in my cash games tonight, even in a tough matchup. But obviously, this being a GPP podcast, he does have big upside for significant discount from the top guys. So As you're looking at cheap guys, there's one guy, FanDuel specific, that stands out. Aaron Nola, coming off a really great performance at Miami. Obviously, we know how bad that offense is, but 8 innings, 6 Ks, no earned runs. Facing off against a San Diego team that has really been struggling. They had a week or two there where they were a little bit better, but as a whole, been terrible this year. Matt Kemp, if he sits out again, I think that's an even better spot for him tonight. Remains to be seen. I haven't heard yet, but he had a sore left shoulder the other day. So if he sits, I really like Aaron Nola. He's $8,000 on DraftKings, not a guy I love at that price tag, but $6K on FanDuel, I like him a lot.
Yeah, definitely. If you're looking for some even cheaper guys, I think Kevin Gausman is still an interesting GPP option. I'm not super excited he's facing Texas in Texas, but for 5,600 on DraftKings, it's kind of hard to argue with him as a flyer at times. There's not a ton else I like really cheap-wise. I'm going to be spending a decent amount on pitching today. There's maybe 2 guys I would consider under like 7,500 today, which is kind of where I end up. I think my like deep GPP play is R.A. Dickey against Detroit. They've been really hot lately, but he's a guy that can get people out any day if that knuckleball is going. For 5,800, I think that's worth taking some shots at in GPPs if you're playing like 20, 25 lineups, something like that. I'm not saying I'm going to run him out there in a ton of games, but for 5,800, the upside is pretty solid. He can get deep into games. He can rack up strikeouts. And like I said, there's just not a lot else I like. Him and Gausman are both really similar to me, where I could see them doing anything from giving you 7 1 or 2 run innings to just getting absolutely worked in the first 3 innings. So that's the definition of a GPP play to me as far as cheap guys go.
Yeah, certainly. And then a middle range guy who wasn't actually supposed to pitch today. It was supposed to be Danny Salazar, but Trevor Bauer is a guy against a struggling Angels offense. Bauer, very inconsistent, but when he gets it going, we know he has massive upside. So I think he's an interesting option. I was looking forward to playing Salazar, but unfortunately that's not the case tonight. So I think he's a guy you consider, but similar to guys like R.A. Dickey, for me, he's like a single bullet if you're making a lot of lineups type of guy.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, moving over here to catcher. I still love Travis d'Arnaud. It's kind of hard not to against the lefty, Henry Owens. I mean, he's been by far the best hitting catcher over the past week. He's got 3 homers, 4 doubles in his last 5 games. That Mets offense scoring a ton of runs. They got a nice high total once again today. I wonder if Russell Martin's going to be in the lineup. I would like him as a cheap option, especially on FanDuel. But obviously, Josh Tolle catches R.A. Dickey, so he'd have to be the DH. So if he is the DH, especially FanDuel where he's cheap, I like him as a cheap option. But other than that, I think Yan Gomes is the guy I'll be playing more often than not. At cheap price tag both sides, gets the lefty, and Heaney's really been struggling. And while you don't love this Cleveland offense against lefty, guys like Gomes and Rayburn are certainly in play. Other catcher options here, Brian McCann as a lefty against Williams Perez. Williams Perez has been terrible against left-handed batters, so any of these lefties you can get in there. McCann should be batting cleanup, you would assume.
Yep.
You like it better at Yankee Stadium, but in this matchup against Perez, I think he's a big upside type of play too.
Yeah, I agree. Not a ton I like at catcher. I definitely think McCann is the top option. I don't mind Vogt in Arizona against Anderson either. That's probably a guy I'll go to a decent amount in GPPs. John Jaso at 2,900 on DraftKings. Looks like 2,500 on FanDuel against Volquez is okay with him in the cleanup spot. It's really helped his RBI numbers. There's a decent amount of other guys you can go cheap-wise. Jesus Montero's near the minimum on both sites, facing a lefty in Danks. In Chicago, which is a pretty good hitter's park. He's going to be low in the lineup, though, so I'm not in love with that. Yan Gomes, decent GPP play. Cleveland's been red hot in general. Gomes has been great against lefties this year. I think he's a decent play. He doesn't have as much upside as a guy like Montero does, despite the higher batting order, unless the whole team goes off.
Yeah, true. And then I'm with you. There's not a whole lot else at catcher that really stands out. First base, though, a different story, of course. You got Edwin Encarnacion, going to be a very popular play today against the lefty at home. He's been locked in. Got to like him. Miguel Cabrera, he gets R.A. Dickey. You mentioned it earlier. It's R.A. Dickey. You can see it going either way, where he gets smashed or he dominates. Obviously, if he gets smashed, Miguel Cabrera should have a big hand in that as well. And then a guy that I like a lot, if he is in the lineup as a low-owned GPP guy, is David Ortiz. Matt Harvey, as we know, very good pitcher, but his biggest struggle is left-handed bats, especially power bats. 14 home runs allowed to lefties so far this season. So if there's one bat I'll be playing against Matt Harvey, it's going to be Big Papi.
Yeah, definitely. I like that as a GPP play. I mean, there's a lot of solid plays today at first base, so you got to think most of these guys are going to be pretty low owned. Edwin Encarnacion is my top play personally against Boyd. I don't love the price, but I think it's going to keep his ownership way down because he hasn't done a lot against lefties over the last few outings against them. So I think he'll be a little bit under-owned because of the price. Prince Fielder against Gaussman's another guy that I think is underpriced a decent amount, 4,000 on DraftKings at least, under 4,000 on FanDuel. He's been rock solid in Texas. I never feel too bad about playing him there against a righty. So that's a guy I'm going to be looking at quite a bit. Brandon Belt, I think, is another guy in that same situation. He's facing Waka, who's a much tougher pitcher, but he's even cheaper than that. So he's an interesting play for me also.
Yeah, and I'll throw out Ryan Zimmerman, a guy that's been hitting the ball really well recently. Gets a bad lefty in Conley today. Washington expected to score some runs, and this is a guy who has been showing some. He's had some good success against lefties, especially this season. 257 WOBA or 257 ISO, 362 WOBA. So I like him. I think he'll be one of those guys that's got big upside. That'll be probably a little bit lower owned than he probably rightfully should be tonight. And then of course Jose Abreu at his price, I like him. And then I like Albert Pujols a great deal now because he is depressed price tag because he was supposed to be facing Salazar. Obviously gets Trevor Bauer now, much more hittable pitcher than Salazar. So I'll be looking his way in some GPPs also.
Yeah, definitely. That's probably the way I'm going for the most part. I'm not really loving the position in general today. I would like to go cheap there if I could, but I'm going to have to wait and see lineup spots on a lot of these guys, I think, because they've been jumping around a lot more, and it's only going to get worse in about 3 days here when we get all these September call-ups.
Yeah, I know. It's gonna be a lot of fun though if we do a little bit of research on these guys. You know, you'll get a ton of low owned guys, especially for tournaments. So that'll be fun. Now moving over to second base, you got Ian Kinsler at Toronto facing a bad pitcher in well, not a bad pitcher necessarily, but an inconsistent pitcher in Dickey. So you got to like him. Although there are some other really good options with some good splits here. You got Anthony Rendon who smashes lefties. He's nice and cheap on both sites. You got Brian Dozier who gets a lefty. It's a good lefty. And Scott Kazmir. But, I mean, all those guys have big-time upside tonight.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm trying to find someone else you haven't named yet that I like a little bit today. But there aren't that many guys that I like, and you've named most of them.
Yeah, there's a couple cheap guys.
Yeah.
Colton Wong is one of them. He's really cheap on FanDuel specifically. He's got the platoon split there. Mentioned.
Yeah, he's only 32 on DraftKings too, so it's not terrible. I'm trying to find one of these other guys. Like Cesar Hernandez, as usual, is pretty cheap, but he's facing Kennedy, and like you mentioned, at pitcher, he's been really, really strong lately, especially against weaker hitting teams, which, I mean, Philadelphia's been up and down lately, but, I mean, I'm not in love with Hernandez, especially if he's not in the 2-hole. Like, he's been dropping down to 7 and 8 at times, too, which makes him a little bit tough to play. Corey Spangenberg is probably my favorite cheap guy, I guess, against Nola. I'm assuming he's probably going to hit second again against a righty.
Yeah, you would think he probably would. I got one cheap guy, another lefty from the Yankees who always goes under him, but has a ton of power, 15 homers on the season. Stephen Drew, he's nice, and you don't love his price tag. He's not quite as minimum salary as you would like him to be, but he's going to be low owned. He has a bunch of pop. He's going to be at the bottom of the order, and he's got, I mean, in a great spot aside from the ballpark. So I think if you want a real cheap guy to expose Williams Perez, I think he's a good way to go too. All right, third base options. Josh Donaldson, of course, your top option, as he always is at home against a lefty. I mean, it's not even particularly close unless you factor in Miguel Cabrera. I mean, obviously, he's got third base eligibility on DraftKings. You can consider him. But then you got some other guys that are pricey that I think will have low ownership. Guys like Miguel Sano. He's one of the most expensive third basemen on both sites, but been smashing everyone. Now finally hitting left-handed pitching like he did in the minors. So I think those are, I mean, your top three guys here are pretty much the guys that, if you're paying up, those are the guys you're going with. Yeah,
I definitely agree. I mean, Donaldson, Cabrera, and Sano were probably my three favorite. I don't mind Alex Rodriguez, but he's a little overpriced to me. couple other guys. Anthony Rendon faces a lefty again. Conley's not a guy that scares me, but Rendon's been awful. He's a little bit overpriced even too, especially in Washington today. I'm not super excited about that, but he's an interesting upside guy, I think. And then Justin Turner is still underpriced to me at 3,400 against Hamill. Is probably more of a cash game play, but I mean he's shown off a decent amount of power lately too.
Yeah, I like that. And then really hot hitter right now. It's a tough matchup. Erasmo Ramirez has actually been very good against lefties, but Mike Moustakas has been tearing the cover off the ball recently, so I think he's a good option there as well. And then David Wright, if he's in the lineup, of course you're looking his way against the lefty. I think that's a fine play too. Also throw out Matt Carpenter. He's in a pretty good spot as well.
Yeah, that's more of a cash game play for me, but I agree. I mean, he's shown enough power lately that you can definitely consider him a GPP play, so I can't argue with it.
Yep. Shortstop options, Troy Tulowitzki, probably going to be pretty popular, especially because he's fairly cheap. 3,800 on FanDuel, 43 on DraftKings. I think he's probably going to be your most popular option, and for good reason. Francisco Lindor, I know a guy you've talked about quite a bit. Gets struggling Andrew Heaney. I mean, this guy's been doing it all. He's been stealing bases, hitting home runs. I think he's one of my favorite swerves off of Tulowitzki if I'm not playing him tonight.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get off Tulowitzki, even though he still just has not looked like the guy that we want him to be. But, I mean, Correa at 4,800, I think he's going to be way under-owned in GPPs at Minnesota against Gibson. Ian Desmond is an interesting upside guy against a lefty today. He's still sporting a 186 ISO against lefties, so there's a lot of power there. Most of the other guys that I have in pretty decent situations feel a little bit overpriced to me. Yunel Escobar is a guy I would play on FanDuel probably a little bit more than DraftKings. He's facing a lefty, probably going to hit in a decent batting order for Washington also. But, yeah, I mean, Lindor is probably the guy that I like if I'm swerving from Tulo the most.
Yeah, I like Wilmer Flores as well. He did get yesterday off, so he should be nice and rested. He's been killing left-handed pitching. Henry Owens has definitely not been a guy that I want to avoid. And then my favorite cheap play, as he usually is, Marwin Gonzalez. Under 3K on both sites. Should be batting second, I would guess. Yeah, if he is, I think he's easily my favorite cheap play.
Yeah.
All right, outfield options. I mean, the top, pretty self-explanatory here. You get Nelson Cruz against one of the worst lefties in baseball, and John Danks at U.S. Cellular Field. You got to love that. Jose Bautista against a lefty at home. You get J.D. Martinez against Dickey at Rogers Center as well. Those guys all in great spots. Mike Trout, crazy cheap on both sites, $4,300. Gets Trevor Bauer now instead of Danny Salazar. So I think that's another one of those examples where you want to try to exploit the cheaper salary that was originally meant for a different pitcher.
Right, definitely. I think that's a great situation to exploit for sure. I like most of these Oakland bats. Billy Burns is a pretty solid option today. He's a little overpriced. I like most of these guys in Arizona, though. Josh Reddick is another one. I mentioned Vogt already when we were at catcher. If Mark Canha is in the lineup, I like him also, even though he feels a little bit overpriced too. A cheaper guy, Byron Buxton's probably going to lead off against Kazmir. Kazmir's a pretty tough lefty, but for $2,900 on DraftKings, it looks like $2,300 on FanDuel. I mean, he's an interesting play, although, I mean, he struggled a little bit against lefties this year and limited at bats, but I'm not too concerned about that long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a couple other guys. Carlos Gomez seems too cheap on both sides against the contact pitcher, Kyle Gibson. I think he's in a good spot. All the Yankee lefties, if Ellsbury's in, definitely Gardner and Beltran. Definitely those guys in play. Chris Colabello seems like he's slightly overpriced on both sides, but has homered in back-to-back games. He's a cheaper way to get some exposure to Toronto. Not necessarily a cheap way, but I think he's a good play. And then, of course, Franklin Gutierrez against a terrible lefty. Homered again last night. Got to think he'll be a pretty popular play at his cheap price tag on both sites.
Yeah, for sure.
And then as we go cheap, of course, Ryan Rayburn. As I'm sure you know, you love Ryan Rayburn in these spots. Nice and cheap on both sides. Pretty much minimum across the board there. So I think if you're punting, he might be the most highly owned outfielder tonight just for that reason. He's the glue guy that makes pretty much any lineup fit there. So I think he's in a good spot too.
Yeah, I would expect him to be. There's some decent other cheap options though. Bourgeois against Jungmann is a fine option at minimum again. I mean, he's struggled a little bit lately, but I mean, he's been a rock solid value play. I mean, you're getting usually a hit at least. out of him almost every game for the minimum, and I feel pretty good about playing that. He's got some upside with his speed too, so I don't mind that. Daniel Nava for Tampa Bay has been hitting second in the order against righties because they've struggled so much against righties. He's flat minimum too. He's been pretty good in the past when he's hit high in the lineup when he was on the Red Sox. So he's a guy that's interesting to me. And then if I'm looking for a little bit of power, Kyle Parker's flat minimum against Liriano today. I assume he's probably going to hit fifth because of all the Rockies lefties. They've been moving that lineup around a ton when they face a lefty. So that's a really interesting one to me also.
Yeah, I like that. And then I think my favorite cheap play with some upside is Andre Ethier against Jason Hamill. He's 2,300 on FanDuel, 28 on DraftKings. Been absolutely killing right-handed pitching, and he's just way too cheap for this matchup. I mean, Hamill is a fine pitcher, but hasn't been pitching well recently, so I'm looking to exploit that, definitely. All right, that's going to wrap things up. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check out all of our great content at dailyfantasycafe.com.